So for my human biology class, we are moving on to the next part of the first section. But I'm going to also post this as a general information video online on YouTube. Because we're going to talk about general things having to do with diseases that apply to the pandemic that we're in the middle of right now. So it could be useful for people to have this. It's basic biology information. Is that ultimately I talk in this section about the evolution of childhood diseases, but even though COVID isn't likely to become a childhood disease, sorry, I just distracted myself because in ways it has some aspects of that. It probably isn't. Talk a little bit about how diseases evolve and how evolution works in general. What happens is not individuals don't evolve, is that a single living thing doesn't evolve except in common English usage, right? We can evolve as people, and we do apply that to individuals during their lifetime. But biologically, evolution happens to groups. And what does that mean? So how do you define a group of living things? There's a lot of differences amongst the individuals. What makes, a chimpanzee and a gorilla, and an orangutan, they're all apes. They're all in our group with us, and they're different from us. And anytime you define a chimpanzee or a gorilla or an orang, you're really talking about your image of what the typical individual in the group is. Now there's going to be individuals in the group that don't fit whatever you say, like, oh, gorillas are bigger. Well, there's going to be some small gorillas. Chimpanzees are smaller. There's going to be some doggone big chimpanzees. Is that orangs tend to be reddish? Well, there are some very, very dark orangs. Humans tend to be hairless. There's a lot of hairy people too. But overall, there's what we consider to be the typical individual that you can kind of spread across the whole group. Well, what evolution does is over time, it changes that. Is the nature of the average typical individual changes because the group has changed. So you can no longer, like if evolution, for one reason or another, tended toward larger and larger chimpanzees, then eventually the typical chimp might be bigger than the typical gorilla. Is that's unlikely to happen for reasons I'm about to get into. What typically makes evolution happen is the conditions around the population shift, they change. And the needs of the individuals in the population also tend to shift. What used to be a really good feature in the old group is no longer necessarily a good feature under the new conditions. On average, it gets significantly colder during the winter, for instance. Well, individuals within the group that were warm enough under the old conditions, they might freeze to death under the new conditions. The ones that are hairier, or have more insulation under their skin, or can stay in their burrows longer, or dig their burrows deeper. There's a whole bunch of features that might benefit individuals in the group under colder climate conditions, provided it continues year after year after year. But what will happen is the cold conditions will start to eliminate members of the population that aren't that suited to it. And it will make it more likely that the ones that are suited to cold conditions survive and pass those features that they have that helps them onto their offspring. So the next generation on average is a little bit better at dealing with the cold. Not, super pop one population generation and it changes, but gradually the features that are useful under the new conditions will become more and more common. Way, way, way down the road, you may look at your population and your average individual and look at the old average individual and go, well, they're not even really the same type anymore. It's how species arise. And over millions and millions and millions of years, you get, group distinctions and other kinds of things. But we're not getting into, the wide swath of evolution. I just want to talk about how evolution works in general. But this depends upon the individuals being different. How do you select for useful features or not useful features if the population are all the same? That's going to turn out to be important in a couple of minutes. But variety, diversity, however you want to say it, variation is a very, very important feature when conditions change. If conditions stay stable, then it doesn't really matter. There are parts of the world that almost never change over time, the middle of the ocean, the edges of the ocean. And there are actually some animals that have stayed the same over very, very long periods of time because they are very well suited to parts of the environment that don't change. Things like open water sharks or horseshoe crabs have been similar way, 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 way back into the fossil record. And they actually have evolved not to evolve. For them, they're more likely to come up with variations that aren't useful than are useful. And how do I know that? Because their coding, their DNA, fixes itself if something goes wrong much better than ours does. So their coding is actually evolved to kind of hold their variations in a very limited way. Because a lot of variations can come from changes in coding. Not the only thing that does it, but it's a big deal. We got to talk about how reproduction happens. And I got to tell you before I list these that partly this is a lie. What's reproduction? It's making more of the same thing, right? Reproduce anything, you're going to make more of the same thing. And in biological terms, we call two things reproduction. Only one of them gives you more of the same thing. So the second one, even though we call it reproduction, it's kind of a lie. And you may be upset to find out it's our type of reproduction. So I'm going to start with the other type that actually is reproduction. Now, what often happens is terms can sometimes be so old that they've kind of outlived their usefulness and have become more confusing than they were. And when they discovered this type of reproduction, they knew how sexual reproduction worked, they thought, and then they discovered things that seemed to be able to reproduce all by themselves without sex. And so they called it asexual reproduction. And it was reproduction without sex. Well, as we've learned about stuff over time, we found that there's something much more genetically specific happening in these two different types of reproduction. So this is not reproduction without sex as a definition anymore. Asexual reproduction is code copying. Is that all of the code that a living thing uses to do all the things a living thing does, all of the DNA, gets copied and passed on to offspring in total. And they may not use it all the same way. Keep in mind, every cell in your body has all of the code. It's a code copy of all the other ones, unless something went screwy. And your skin cells can be skin cells, and your muscle cells can be muscle cells, and your brain cells can be brain cells. They don't all use all the same codes all the time. So even out there in the world where offspring are whole individuals, they don't necessarily look or act like the original if other things are at play. They use different genes. Is that a little coral can produce jellyfish, and they are code copies of the original coral. Now there's a downside to this type of reproduction. The upside is you can make copies. If the whole idea about reproduction is perpetuating yourself, then this is the only one that really does that. But the downside is what we talked about before. They're all the same. And in a world where conditions stay the same and they're very well suited to conditions, they can go happily on for millions and millions and millions of generations. But if conditions change in a way that works against them, they're basically all in trouble. Is that they all have the same strengths and weaknesses, and when the weaknesses become important, they are very vulnerable. So how can there even be asexual reproducers if this is because conditions have changed in most of the world? Well, they have a little bit of a workaround for this that isn't really a feature of the reproduction, but it is a feature you find in asexual reproducers. Asexual reproducers are very prolific. They make lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring. And what does that do? I'll give you an example and then I'll tell you what it does. So somebody comes into my classroom and they have a bacterial lung infection. They got bronchitis and it's a bacterial bronchitis. A lot of them are viral. Also asexual reproducers, but we're not doing viruses. So as often infections do, they chemically do stuff to you to help you spread their offspring. They're in there happily making copies of their bacterial codes, putting them in new bacteria and making you cough and sneeze, and you're spreading it to the people around you. Lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring. Maybe spreads to half the class. So one thing huge numbers does is it spreads out your offspring. It may spread them out beyond the edges of whatever the change conditions are. So say the student that comes in 6 got a doctor's appointment that afternoon. They go and the doctor goes, you got a bacterial infection. Here's a shot of penicillin. They give them a shot of antibiotic, which is a poison that poisons specifically bacteria. Bacterial cells are different from ours. They have some different chemistry. And antibiotics poison that. That's why I didn't use viruses. Viruses use our own chemistry against us, so poisoning that's usually a bad idea. And so all of the population in that student is susceptible to the penicillin, and they all die. Does everybody in the classroom that caught it from that student go to see their doctor and get a shot of penicillin, or do they just fight it off? Well, if one student in that classroom doesn't go to the doctor, and they just spend a few days spreading new offspring to other people, then the old version that was asexually made in the first place is still out there, still spreading through the world. It's another thing the huge numbers do. You can get variation from code changes, DNA mutations. Now, most of the time, a change in the DNA doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really change the abilities of the recipient. You have mutations all over your body. Somebody estimated a few years ago, like maybe a couple hundred on average, compared one cell in your body to another cell in your body. But most of the time, it does absolutely nothing to you, nothing noticeable. If it does get into your code and changes your code, it's, again, likely not to change much in what the code is doing. If it changes what the code is doing, what the product of the code is doing, it's much more likely to screw it up than to make it better. So mutations tend to mostly be kind of neutral, not do anything. When they do something, they tend to do something bad because they've screwed something up, more likely than made it better. But every once in a while, in the right conditions, they make things better. So what are the odds that this bronchitis bacterium can produce a mutant that penicillin won't kill? changes the chemistry penicillin is going after, or clears it out of their cells. It does something, so penicillin doesn't kill it. The odds are astronomical. But think of that bacterium spreading to the people in the room, spreading to people in the next class, spreading to people in the supermarket, spreading all over the place. Astronomical numbers of bacteria are at play here. And for the one bacterium that gets the right mutation that'll make it survive penicillin, if they also wind up in somebody that goes to their doctor and gets a shot, you have a bacterium that penicillin won't kill. It's changed its coding, so now it's making copies of that in all of its offspring. That person doesn't realize right away, right? It's killed 99.9% of their bacteria, so they don't feel sick. When the bronchitis comes back, chances are they're going to spread the penicillin-resistant strain, that's what they call it now, to people, and now penicillin won't work on it. And now you need another antibiotic, and the bacteria need another mutation in order to be penicillin and tetracycline resistant. But that's how this all works. Lots and lots of offspring gives you the variation that you need as an asexual reproducer to survive in a changing world. So there's the other type of reproduction, which isn't really reproduction. And this one is even less like what you think it is. Here, this happens in living things that have not just one set of codes, but two sets of codes. Two sets of codes that do the same thing. They may not be exactly the same codes for each thing, but they have two sets of codes that do the same things. And they take them apart kind of randomly. One of this one of this pair, one of that pair, one of this pair. And so they get one set of codes, and then they can recombine them with another set. Now, you go, well, you didn't say two parents, because it doesn't require two parents. There's a lot of living things in the world that can do this all by themselves. Plants, awful lot of flowering plants can do this. An awful lot of animals can do this, can sexually reproduce by randomly sorting out one set, randomly sorting out another set, recombining them. What the hell am I talking about? Think about this. If you could do this as a human being, you were a true hermaphrodite, where you have working male and working female systems. Very, very rare, but it actually does happen. So you could make a sperm with one set of chromosomes. That's going to be a mix of your mother's and your father's chromosomes. Number 1 might be from mom, number 2 might be from mom, number 3 might be from dad, number 4 might be from mom. Egg cell made the same way. Number 1 might be from mom, and if that egg cell and that sperm get together, you have both codes from mom and no codes from dad for that whole chromosome, all the codes on that chromosome. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You could make, if you're, the sperm making process could produce sperm with X chromosomes or sperm with Y chromosomes. The egg making process would only make X. But that means you could make males, a Y and an X, or females, an X and an X. So if we could sexually reproduce by ourselves, we would produce a lot of offspring that are different from us, that have a different code mixture. That's variation. There's a reason why, if you're looking at big things, you're looking at big animals and big plants, they're sexual reproducers, because cranking out huge, huge, huge numbers of offspring, the environments won't support that if you're big. There's only really little things are asexual reproducers. Some of them go back and forth, sexual and asexual, like it's weird. But high variation is great. The downside is this is not really reproduction. You can't make a copy of yourself. I mean, you can. The odds of you taking those 23 chromosomes and 23 chromosomes and getting 23 that came from your mom and 23 that came from your dad, and putting them together and getting a copy of yourself, you could sit down and do the math, but the odds there are astronomical, and we don't make astronomical numbers of offspring. So there's that. Okay, I'm going to do this in a couple of sections. This was kind of the introduction to how this all works. The reason I'm doing this is that things that get in us and make us sick, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, even some worms, tend to be asexual reproducers. We, the hosts, are sexual reproducers. When diseases enter the host, we become their ecosystem, and we are now their conditions, and they are now changing our conditions. So evolution is something that happens with diseases, and how diseases evolve is what the next section is going to be about.